planes in ptfs, but there's a catch. The planes get bigger. So, yeah. See what the first plane. So our first and second plane will be. So the first plane is the Cessna 152, but since there's no Cessna 152, we will be using the Cessna 172. So let's get in our Cessna 172. Let's go with gold and black. So, and then our second plane will be a Yak 40, but because there's no Yak 42, for the second plane, we will use the classic 727. So let's take off in the Cessna 1. I'm going to call it the Cessna 152 right now, because that's the plane we're going to be using. So the Cessna 152 takes off and makes a sharp turn, headed to Perth International for some reason, even though it's a humongous airport, when suddenly, boom, their engine comes to a fail. So they decided to glide the 152 to the airport. Even though the airport was close, they decided to try and ditch the plane. But for some reason, they also thought that was too risky, so they just decided to glide the plane to the airport, descending to a much safer altitude. But the plane was losing speed quickly. And soon, there was a problem. Only at 63 knots, as the plane was making it to the airport. Oh yeah, I forgot you can't stall. And then the engine shut down completely, causing the 152 to tragically stall. The pilot tried to pull the plane up, but the Cessna 152 refused. The plane leveled out, came to a bank. Because of the massive fire, it caused the fuel tank to explode, causing the entire plane to explode. Unfortunately, only the co-pilot survived the crash. Okay, for the Yak 42, we'll be using the 727. Let's go with United. Even though United never operated a Yak 42, I'm gonna call it a Yak 40. I'm gonna call it a Yak 40. The Yak 42 was now had taken off from Tokyo International, bound for Great Rockford, which I recently found out was based off of Manchester Airport. And soon, the plane was coming towards Great Rockford, but the Yak 42 had collided into a Yak 42, which caused the plane to bank sharply because they were missing some of their wing. And only a few minutes from takeoff, the plane crashed in the ocean near Tokyo. The next plane is the Embraer E175, but the closest plane we'll get to that is the E190. So we'll use the E190 and the lot Polish Airlines. I'm going to call it the Embraer E175 just for the sake of the video. So one day, lot flight 3243 was taxiing to the runway. But let me just do something. And we're going to use this as Warsaw Airport, even though it's actually GR. But we're going to pretend it's Warsaw in Poland for all my Polish viewers that watch my channel. The plane had taxied to the runway. It was now ready to take off to the airport. To the airport in front of us is Rolani. The plane had taken off from Warsaw, but just a few minutes after takeoff, the plane encountered a hydraulic failure, which caused the plane to divert back to Warsaw. As the flaps were now deploying and gear was down, hold on. So the Embraer E175 had to get diverted back to Warsaw. Had to take off from Mellor to get that Warsaw approach, also known as Great Rockford. And soon, the plane was on their way back to Warsaw. See you at Warsaw. For some reason, the plane decided to fly at a low altitude, nearly hitting a building. They were only flying around 200 feet, nearly crashing, but soon decided to go to a safer altitude. Soon the plane had made a sharp turn, and the gear deployed. Flaps were now deploying, but as the plane was approaching the runway, it caused some turbulence, and for the small plane, it was catastrophic. The plane veered off the runway, trying to do a go around. But the plane's pilot accidentally put on the reverse thrust for some reason. So during the go around, the flight ended up stalling. As they deployed the gear once again for the emergency landing, but the engines ran out of fuel, and the gear broke because of the hard landing, and the plane crashed into a field. Out of the hard landing, only 4 people died, and everybody else survived, with a few with major and minor injuries. Our next plane is Airbus A319. But because there's no A319, we'll just be using the A320. A320. Just like the other planes, I am going to call this plane an A319. We'll be losing the Lufthansa livery. So, on March 4th, 2025, Lufthansa Flight 3243, an A320, was taxiing to the runway. It was ready to take off from runway 33. As the plane sped down the runway, it took off, everything going to plan, when suddenly the flaps were left down. Still, somehow the plane was still engine speed. But the plane had forgot to refuel, so the engines had to shut off. The plane decided to try and keep itself in the air. They decided to retract the flaps to gain speed, but Tokyo was still a few miles away. So the plane was in deep trouble. Then, all of a sudden, the plane, while stalling, banked sharply, flew upside down. Sorry about all the charger fan stuff. So the plane flew upside down and crashed. Now, with some bigger planes, with the AN-22, the biggest turboprop in the world. On March 10th, 2024, Antonov Flight 3243 was ready to take off from Tokyo, Haneda. See you at the runway. The plane, instead of taxiing all the way down to the final yellow taxi line, they just decided to taxi to the runway, nearly colliding into a KLM flight. Soon the propellers regaining some power, and the plane was getting ready to take off into the night sky to Perth International. And as soon as the plane took off, the plane encountered a load shift, causing the plane to end up into a stall. And the plane ended up stalling. The plane decided to try and divert to the floating part as they were stalling very fast. The plane was continuing to stall, banked sharply, clipped its wing, sharply banked, and crashed into the ocean, still with some of the plane floating. And a couple minutes later, the plane sunk. Unfortunately, the crew could not escape in time and drowned. Next plane is the Tupolev Tu-145. So, we'll have to use our good old 727 friend again. Singapore. The top board. So, Singapore Airlines flight 3243. Every flight number is going to be the same. Sorry about that. Tupolev Tu-145. I know Singapore never operated Tu-145s. Had taken off into the night sky. As the plane took off, lightning struck onto the side. Lightning struck onto the right engine. And the right engine was now on fire. Without the crew knowing about the engine on fire, but some passengers sitting at the back of the plane saw the right engine on fire and told the crew about it, and the crew told the captain. and the plane was now on their way to Great Rockford for emergency landing. But on their way, there was a pole up ahead. And because of the damaged engine, they couldn't turn in time. So the wing clipped the pole, causing some damage to the wing, causing the plane to sharply bank. The gear was deployed for emergency landing. The plane was able to bank out of get out of the bank, and was now trying to get to Great Rockford. But for some reason, both engines now have failed, causing the plane to end up into a very quick stall, about to crash into a field as our Yak 40, the gear, it broke off. And the plane slid out of the field, breaking up into two parts. The cockpit, and just before the wings, and the back, just before the wings. The plane was now very damaged, but at least the field put out the fire. Just pretend the fire is not there. Our next plane is a Boeing 737 MAX. Just pretend it's a MAX. And we'll be calling it a 737 MAX 8, I think. It is a 7 MAX 8. Let me double check. Yeah, it's a MAX 8. And the Polish Airlines livery again. So we're pretending Southampton Airport will be Great Rockford. Warsaw Airport in Poland, I believe. On March 20th, lot flight 3243 had taxied to the runway. But the runway was very short because they have taxied onto the final taxi zone. And the plane did not have enough time to take off. But when they did, they nearly overran. As slowly gained in altitude, heading to Mellor, the plane had to divert due to a terrorist bombing at Mellor. So the plane was on their way to Grindavik. But all of a sudden, for no flipping reason, the same Legacy 600 that collided into GOL 1907 collided into the slot flight, causing the plane to do one full loop, and for some reason, still able to fly even without some of its winglet. So they decided to make the emergency landing. Suddenly, bang, boom. There were two loud bangs. One was a left engine exploding because of leaking fuel. And the gear, when they were deploying gear, that caused the second bang was the left gear braking. Then, once again, a hijacker named Gerald, same Gerald from my Spirit Airlines stories, made the plane go into the reverse thrust to lose speed and try to hijack it and crash it into the mountains at Grindavik. Both the pilot and the hijacker kept fighting over the controls. The pilot declared to retract the landing gear and declare a belly landing. They decided to quickly lower some speed and dump fuel because they still had a lot of fuel left to not cause a fire. And then the hijacker, put the plane up to full power once again. But the pilot knew what to do and tricked the hijacker by deploying the landing gear and I can't deploy flaps for some reason. The pilot had deployed the flaps and landing gear. The hijacker said, "Bro, you said you were going to do a belly landing. I tricked you," said. And, the pilot. But then, just as they were about to touch down, the hijacker interfered for one final time, heading towards the mountain, causing the plane to lose its winglet, sharply bang because they lost their winglet and engine and crash into the ocean. Fortunately, everybody lost their life. Our next plane is a 747 freighter. So let's go spawn in our freighter and tell this our second to last story. No, not 757. 747. Let's go with the classic UPS. Boom. See how that runs. So, a UPS Flight 3243 decided to cut off Delta 6144, and was now ready to take off. Sorry for the shaky camera. So, Boeing 747-400 freighter had taken off. And all seemed well. Let's just wait for the plane to load in quickly. There we go. Worldwide services. That's when, after takeoff, boom. Both right engines have failed, causing the plane to have to divert to Miller instead of Tokyo for some reason. And soon they were on their way to Miller, losing speed quite fast. And soon they saw Miller in the distance. Decided what to do next. The pilot miraculously pulled the nose down for some reason, made the plane nearly touch water, and for some reason decided to do fun and tried to fly through the pole, but tragically crashed. Unfortunately, only the co-pilot / first officer survived. Okay, time to crash the final plane. Sorry that this video might take a long time to upload because it's gonna be 24 minutes. Potentially 25. Depending on how long this final crash will be. And that's gonna be the King of the Skies. A classic, good old A380 friend. With the Lufthansa nice Lufthansa livery. Just pretend it's the old Lufthansa livery. So for our final flight, Lufthansa flight 3241, same flight number as always, was for some reason stalling. But soon they got out of their stall and was now taxiing to the runway. But for some reason, the pilot put full power to the engines before taxiing onto the runway. And soon, the plane was speeding down the runway, ready for takeoff. The massive airliner had taken off, thinking it would be all's well's flight to Perth, when all the engines ran out of fuel. Deciding what to do next, for some reason, the pilot made a smart move and tried to divert back to Tokyo with the unlimited speed the plane had. Unfortunately, the plane did not have enough speed and tragically ended up stalling. The plane stalled for a while, with the pilot deploying gears, declaring an emergency landing at Tokyo. But just a few miles from, and miraculously, the plane hardly touched down. Reverse thrusts were put on, but unfortunately, the plane had fallen off the bridge and into the water. No. Oh, wait, what? No, why am I frozen? Oh, I died. Oh, well. So, yeah. Miraculously, all the people at the back of the plane were able to escape and get back to Tokyo and wait for a new flight. Well, hold on. Well, I hope you enjoyed those crashes. So don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next video. What? Am I in the airport? Is that a Ryanair 737? Yeah. I'm doing one last crash. But first, we have to take a trip. We're now going to head to a different country for this final crash. So we are now heading to Perth in Australia, and I got to get to record in the cockpit. Very cool. Now I know what a 737 cockpit looks like. Okay, so we are now on approach to our destination because I can see runway up ahead. So I think we are going to start our descent pretty soon. Dunk. Very nice. Landing gear is now deployed. Flaps are now deployed. And we are lowering speed. Looks like we are now coming in to land. Why the heck is American here? Get off the runway, you! Oofy! That was a hard landing. Okay, so we are now heading to one final spot to crash. Heading to one final spot to crash a plane. So we are going to crash a straddle launch. But because there is no strat to launch, we're going to have to crash the AN-225 Malia. Because I mean, come on. Both planes have 6 engines, so it makes sense to crash the Antonov. No flight number for no reason, I guess. So, for some reason, oh no. Hold on. So, the plane had taken off and was bound for Tokyo. But, due to not refueling, the plane, the Antonov's engines, had ran out of fuel. So they decided to divert back to Perth. But it was so hard to turn the heavy plane that they eventually began stalling. If there was only a miracle, unfortunately, the plane continued on nosediving. When all of a sudden, the engines were able to gain full power again. That's because the plane's engines that's because the plane's engines only malfunctioned. Although this middle engine right here that I'm looking at could not turn back on. That middle engine right there had actually ran out of fuel. For some reason, the pilot decided to try and land at St. Barth. The plane, but for some reason, hold on. Never mind. If I could do something hilarious, apparently I cannot. As the plane was on approach, the engines had actually ran out of fuel. And the plane was now coming in for emergency landing here in St. Barth. The plane descended very quick. So quick that they nearly touched the water and before the runway. The plane had tilted onto its wing, pulled up, and eventually began stalling. Some of the gear were broken, and the plane eventually ended up stalling, crashed along, destroyed through a couple of buildings, and crashed into a mountain. So, for real, I hope you enjoyed this video. So don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next vid.